amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello, listeners, and welcome. I'm delighted to say that my guest today is Professor Georgia Chenevix-Trench. Georgia is a worldwide recognised cancer researcher who investigates genetic predispositions to cancer. She is head of cancer genetics at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, now known as QIMR Berghofer, and 2022 winner of the GSK Award for Research Excellence. She has published over 400 papers in journals and was elected to the Australian Academy of Science in 2014 for her work on the genetics of breast, ovarian and other cancers, including showing mutations in the ATM gene for breast cancer. In 2015, she was elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. She was awarded the Suzanne Cory Medal and Lecture by the Australian Academy of Science and awarded the 2022 GSK Award for Research Excellence. And there is so much more. But welcome, Professor, or if I may call you Georgia.
Certainly, and thank you.
Georgia, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear a little bit about your early life. I know you were born in Nairobi in Kenya, but do tell us more. I mean, your name, Chenevix-Trench, is fascinating. So what are the origins?
It is an interesting story. So my great-great-great-grandmother was a woman called Melusina Chenevix, who was extremely remarkable and did the rather unusual thing in those days for an upper-class woman of rearing her children herself.
Right.
And her two sons, were so devoted to her sons that survived to adulthood, that when she died, they took the name Chenevix as part of their last name. She had married a Trench. They were born Trenches, but they became Chenevix-Trenches. So there are not very many generations of Chenevix-Trenches, half of whom were descended from my great-great-grandfather, who was the instigator of the Oxford English Dictionary, Dean of Westminster, Archbishop of Dublin. He's married and he's buried in Westminster Abbey in the Central Isle, and himself was fairly remarkable.
Gosh.
He also founded the school that I went to in Dublin, Alexandra College for Young Ladies.
So when you came back from Nairobi in Kenya, you were very young, I think, weren't you? So you were brought up in Dublin and you studied at Trinity College in Dublin. And, of course, Trinity's known right around the world. So to be there as a student must have been terrific.
Well, we actually went first to England for a while and moved to Ireland when I was about 12. So, yes.
Oh, right.
Went to school in Dublin and then to Trinity, which was absolutely fantastic. It has, for many parts of its history, it's got a fascinating history in lots of ways. There was a period when women could attend lectures at Oxford and Cambridge but not get their degrees, and so they were sent on the boat to Dublin to get their degrees from Trinity College,
I didn't
Dublin.
know that, yes.
Yep, very interesting. And for much of its history, it's really been regarded as one of the top 3 universities in England and Ireland, and very common for English students to go to Trinity College Dublin, many European students, of course, and it was a fabulous, quite small university right in the heart of Dublin, which made life lots of fun.
It would have been, I can imagine it would have been great fun. But later you were awarded a PhD, that was in 1985, from the Department of Human Genetics at the Medical College of Virginia in USA. So tell us what that was like.
By comparison to Trinity College Dublin, very, very, very dull, I think would be a fair comment. It's historically a very interesting place, but the southern US is kind of strange compared to living in Dublin. And I finished my PhD, married an Australian, and decided that we definitely would rather live in Australia, so came back here in 1986.
But you commenced your postdoctoral work there, didn't you?
Yes, so I've only ever worked at QIMR. I came fresh out of my PhD. We had a very far-sighted director at that time who quite often appointed couples. My husband was much more senior. He wanted Nick to come here, and in order to seal that deal, threw in a postdoc position for me. So I was really untested, sight unseen. I'd done a fairly dull PhD. But Chev gave us the confidence and was extremely supportive, and we've been here ever since.
So, yes, your husband's also very involved in medical research, isn't he?
Yes, he's also a geneticist working at the same institute, and genetics in Queensland has completely transformed in the 40 years or so we've been here. It was, one has to say, a backwater for genetics research, at least when we started, and is now one of the top cities in the world for carrying out genetic research. So it's really been fascinating to see it change.
It's extraordinary. I mean, you did start, as you say, here in QIMR, but tell us back then, 40 years ago? Gosh, time does fly. But tell us a little bit about QIMR. What is it, for our listeners who may not know? What does it do, and how does it operate? Sort of the bigger picture there, Georgia.
Well, it is the Queensland Institute of Medical Research. It's supported in part by a state grant. It was initiated initially to keep tropical diseases at bay in Queensland, and so it still has quite a strong program in tropical health, mosquito control. But in the time we've been here, it's obviously diversified a good deal, and it's now got very strong programs in immunology, in cancer, in public health. It's known for many things, particularly a lot of the work that Adele Green has done on the effect of sunlight and cancer in Queensland, including a clinical trial to show the effect of using sunscreen. It's got very strong programs in genetics, particularly in the genetics of complex diseases, not just so-called simple Mendelian diseases. And when we came, it was about 100 people, and it's now probably more like 600 or 700. Oh, we came to a building that was beside the hospital. We've since moved into a total of 3 new buildings who are now all joined up together. And much of that has been funded by the philanthropist Chuck Feeney, who gave a lot of money to medical research in Queensland. And we're a big beneficiary of that in terms of getting the buildings built.
Right. I was going to ask you, yes, how do you get your finance? Because, I mean, you have got a large department there, and it obviously needs finance in order to do all that wonderful research.
Well, the state grant funds mostly the infrastructure for the institute. The buildings came from a combination of Chuck Feeney and state and federal funding, but most of what we call the soft money, the money we actually use to do our research, to employ postdocs and technicians, to buy the mice, to do the experiments, that mostly comes from competitive funding from the NH and MRC and from other smaller organizations in Australia. And in the past, we've had quite a lot of American money, including from the US Army.
Oh, right.
So it comes from a whole variety of sources. But, my salary has been supported by grants for almost all of my time here, I think.
Right.
From 1989 or whatever, I brought in my salary from NH and MRC.
I mean, you've had a very long and a very successful career in medical research. So can you just tell us what are some of the milestones and successes which stand out for you over that time?
Well, the first thing I started working on when I got here very early on was an inherited skin cancer called basal cell nevus syndrome, or Gorlin syndrome, which is a complicated syndrome in which they get thousands in Australia of basal cell carcinomas, but also have various other features. And I can hardly believe it now. I was a very young postdoc, and there was nobody else in the country who could help me on this project. And so I flew all around the place from Geraldton to Townsville, identifying these families, diagnosing them. Luckily, my time in Virginia, I'd actually been taught quite a lot of clinical genetics, so I was able to make those diagnoses, drawing their bloods, bringing them back to Brisbane. And we first of all identified the location on the chromosome where the gene was positioned, and then as part of an international collaboration actually identified the gene. And that was particularly important because although it's a very rare syndrome, it opened up a whole world of understanding how important this gene and its pathway was in many different kinds of cancers, including a childhood brain cancer, for example. And there are now drugs against this gene product that are in clinical use for different cancers. So it was a classic case of what they call in genetics, treasure your exceptions. This is a very exceptional and rare syndrome, but it can tell you a whole lot about the more general human condition.
Right, right.
So that was a major landmark. Then probably the next one was in about 1995, Australia was lucky enough to attract back from America a very remarkable man called Joe Sambrook, who went to Melbourne. Remarkable, eccentric, delightful. And he stimulated a national organization to look at the genetics of familial breast and ovarian cancer. And that then became really the foundation of my research ever since. We started, as I say, in 1995. We've been continually funded by the National Breast Cancer Foundation since then. And it was very unusual in that it wasn't in itself a research project. It was actually a collection, and the intention was to make that collection of data and biological samples available to researchers anywhere in the world to use.
Right.
So that was a very unusual model and has stimulated an enormous amount of research, not only in my lab, but in dozens of labs around the world.
How incredible. I mean, I know many of our listeners have either had cancer or know someone who has. And as you and many of our listeners know, I'm in remission from ovarian cancer. So your research is, it's of particular interest to me. But how can anyone tell if they're destined to get cancer? I mean, I know lifestyle, diet, sort of contribute. But to someone like me who spends hours wondering, gosh, what the hell did I do wrong? Or is it just bad luck? Or what?
Well, I mean, in your case for ovarian cancer, I'd say just bad luck, unless you have a genetic predisposition of some kind. Obviously, there are other cancers like melanoma and lung cancer where there are major environmental factors.
Right.
But outside of those very obvious examples, most cancers are caused by a mixture of subtle genetic predisposition, not necessarily because of a major gene like BRCA1, the main breast cancer gene, but a combination of hundreds of subtle genetic variants that increase your risk.
Yes.
Probably also various environmental lifestyle factors, and a big dose of bad luck.
Yes, I have been told that. But your research really has just been magnificent in all fields, but particularly in the breast and ovarian cancers. And all around the world, Georgia, your research is known, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, the work I've done throughout my life has received some international attention because it's got general applicability. But in about 20 years ago, we realized that even more we needed to work on a large global scale, and that there was a limit to what you could do within one country or one study. And so we started 3 different big international consortia, one specifically to look at the genetics of breast cancer, one to look at the genetics of ovarian cancer, and one to look at the issue of modifiers of the major breast cancer genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, which is the consortium that I run in particular. And those have worked very successfully together for the last 20 years or so and have had many profound findings that now allow us to predict with much more certainty who in the general population is likely to get breast cancer.
Right.
And if you carry a mutation in one of these major genes, what your likelihood is of developing cancer.
Right. What an incredible step forward. Now, you're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is Professor Georgia Chenevix-Trench, world-renowned cancer researcher. Now, Georgia, can you tell us a little bit about a day in the life of a research professor? I mean, I imagine sort of all incubators, files, Bunsen burners and laboratories, or is that not how it is?
Well, there's a big difference between the people who run the lab and the people who work in the lab.
Right.
And it's probably fair to say that most people who run a lab, not everybody, but most people who run a lab stop themselves doing experiments about 15 years after their PhD. In my case, that was partly generated by having children, which means that you have to pick up your kids at a fixed time and you can't afford to be doing experiments that run late in the evening. That was partly it. But it's mostly because you get to a point where if you run a lab, the vast majority of your time is spent writing grant applications, writing papers that have from data generated from your lab, reviewing other people's grants applications as a sort of community service, and doing the administrative things that come from running a group. And so it happens, but it's unusual to find senior people who actually spend their time in the research lab.
Right. Now, we talked about you growing up in Ireland, or England and Ireland, and going to Trinity University. And as my listeners know, I was also brought up in Ireland and go back regularly. Do you go back regularly? I mean, I know your family lived near mine in Tipperary. Do you have a desire to go back there to live? And I know you've got grandchildren in England, haven't you?
I do. No, I can't ever see living in Ireland again. When my parents were still there, I went back a lot. Every year. The year my father was dying, I went back 5 times. My mother sold up in 2008, and so I didn't go back so much from then. But the occasions I've been back have been absolutely fantastic. And every time I leave, I think I must come more often. I must come for longer. And maybe when I don't run a lab anymore, I will do that. But yes, it remains very dear to my heart.
I know the feeling. And to our listeners, extraordinary coincidence, I was going through some of my parents' memories and letters and whatever, because sadly they both died in Ireland. And I came across letters between Georgia's father and my father when they were writing a bit of history about Ireland back in the 1970s, I think, wasn't it, Georgia? 1980s. So,
yes. That probably would have been in the 70s.
Yes, extraordinary time. Now, how do you see sort of the future of research going in the world, and how do you think AI will influence it and other academic fields?
Look, you ask obviously at a time of tumult, and, so there are lots of questions at the moment. AI is already having a big impact. I suspect there's not a scientist anywhere who doesn't use ChatGPT for all kinds of things at the moment, and it will impact more and more on every facet of science. The truth is that science is badly underfunded in Australia. I can never remember a time when the research field has been so depressed. And as an example, for my early part of my career, the success rate for getting an NH and MRC grant was about 20 to 25%. And that doesn't sound much, but actually you don't want to fund more than about 30% of grants. The others have got major flaws. So in retrospect, that was fantastic. And it meant that anybody who was good may not get their grant the first time, but they'd get it the second or third time. We're now at a time when those grants, which are the sort of workhorse of research in Australia, are funded at somewhere around 7, 8, 9%. And that is a really big drop. And it means that excellent people never get their grants funded and are leaving science in droves.
Right.
There's also a huge imbalance. I think they've completely overcorrected for the fact that they used to fund more grants to men than to women. There's now a huge overcorrection. So if you're a man, it's even more difficult to get a grant. Something about which I and others have protested, but nobody cares.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It seems, sort of worldwide, isn't it, in many, many fields?
Yeah, complete overreaction, I think.
Yes.
So I'm actually a little gloomy about the future of research in Australia. There's a lot of money in what's called the Medical Research Future Fund, and that's a much more translational form of research funding where they're really trying to get discoveries into the clinic, and that's great, but there won't be discoveries to put into the clinic in future unless we fund the basic science. You absolutely need to be funding both.
Right. What do we do as a member of the general public to try and get people to listen and to fund more research?
Well, as they always say, MPs respond to the numbers of letters they get. So, if enough people write to their federal MPs and say we really need to put more money into basic medical research, maybe somebody will take some notice. But as you can see from listening to the news, it's not exactly high up anybody's agenda at the moment. We've got so many challenges facing the country that it's difficult to see that this will be a quick fix. But as a percentage of GDP, we spend much less than many so-called Western countries, way below many countries in Asia, and that is very concerning.
How does it sort of hold up against Ireland? You know, we had Professor Ian Henderson of the microbiology on our show not long ago, and he too, of course, was from Ireland, the land of saints and scholars, and you and he certainly show us about the scholars part. But how does sort of Ireland or other European countries hold up?
I don't know about their percentage of GDP. I think it's probably very low in Ireland, but they do have access to EU funds, of course, and that can be very effective. I know that the genetics department in Dublin has got a lot of funds from the EU.
Right.
We've also, as part of our international collaborations, had EU funds in the past. They come at a bit of a price, at a huge administrative price, but there is a lot of money there. So I think that has certainly probably saved Ireland in the last 10, 15 years or so.
What do you do to sort of relax at the end of the day? Your husband, as we know, Nick, is a professor at QIMR in medical research. Do you discuss things at home constantly, or is that off limits? You just go home? I know you've got two beautiful dogs here in Brisbane.
We do talk about work, but perhaps less than you might expect, in that we've both been immersed in it all day. When we go home, we're actually happy to do other things and talk about other things. We certainly do our relaxing by gardening. We have multiple gardens for various reasons, and travel.
Right.
Our daughters live in Melbourne, Australia, and Melbourne, England, just to confuse things greatly.
Yeah.
So we try to spend time in both Melbournes. So yes, I would say gardening, socialising, and travelling, and reading would be and music. We go to a lot of concerts in Brisbane. Brisbane is a wonderful place for classical music and chamber music in particular. So we go to a lot of concerts.
It is, yes. No, we're very, very lucky here in Brisbane. How did you meet?
I was doing my PhD in Virginia, and one of the people on the faculty there had been his PhD supervisor in Birmingham when he did his in Birmingham. So he was visiting this man, Lyndon, who is an Anglican priest and a geneticist, and that's how we met. And he ultimately married us as an Anglican priest.
Oh, right.
Which was interesting.
And yes, it's terrific that you are both in the same field, and that you enjoy doing so much together, including travelling. Have you got any special travel plans for the future?
Well, we've just had a month in Tasmania, Africa, and Malta.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Yes.
An eclectic combination. We're about to have a month in Italy.
Yes.
Bookmarked by conferences in June. And yes, there's always a long list of places we want to go. That's never a problem.
Oh, how lovely. Now, you said you have two daughters. Have they followed in your and your husband's footsteps into medical research at all?
Interestingly enough, the eldest one is a geneticist, a human geneticist at what's called the Sanger Centre, which is the sort of premier genetics or research institute in England near Cambridge. And the younger one is a medical oncologist in Melbourne, probably specialising mostly on breast cancer.
Right.
So yes, they could hardly have followed more closely, really.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? And then, of course, there's grandchildren online as well.
Indeed, yes. It's early to tell what they'll do, but it's a real pleasure having grandchildren. And I'm always pleased to see my children carving out successful careers and saying quite openly that they were very happy for their mother to work hard and have a career, and they don't in any way resent that. They expect and want to do the same for themselves. So that's a mark of confidence. It's good.
Actually, that's a wonderful thing to say and to think, isn't it? Because I know as a working mother, you spend a lot of time feeling guilty, don't you? Or I did. When I was with children, I thought I should be at work. And when I was at work, I thought I should be with the children. And it's always the two things tearing you in different directions, isn't it?
They do in terms of time, actually. I have to say I never felt guilty, provided I felt they were being well looked after and they were happy.
Yes.
I never felt guilty about it, but yes, you're certainly torn in both directions and you're time poor. But I think they also benefit a lot from that. They get probably a much closer relationship with their father than they would otherwise, which is good. And, from Hilary, when Hilary was 6 months old, I went to my first conference and left her with Nick, and he managed just fine.
Oh, how wonderful. And of course, you've got similar interests to be able to discuss, haven't you, over the dinner table?
I think the most important thing is that you have a sympathy for each other's needs. You understand what the pressures are, what the time pressures are, what the demands are, and that was incredibly useful.
Right. I can imagine, absolutely. Georgia, how do you see your future? Is retirement on the horizon? And if so, what would you like to do that you have not been able to do because of your hard work? I know you do travel, but obviously there's the call of your research that brings you back here to Brisbane.
Well, it's a big question, of course, for people in science as to when and how you retire. Do you stay there till you're carried out in a box? Do you wait until your funding runs out? Or do you make a plan to retire? And I decided 4.5 years ago, when I got my last big 5-year grant, that I would make a plan and that I would not try to renew it at the end of this year. And I did that partly because I don't want to be running a lab at 71, partly because there's such a shortage of money. I think the money should be going to people who are younger and hungrier and still paying off their mortgage.
Right.
And partly because I want to spend more time supporting my daughter's careers, helping to look after my grandchildren, etc.
Yes.
So I'll be closing my lab at the end of this year, but I won't be winding out altogether. I'll continue my international collaborations. I'll have some money left to continue some projects that I'm still doing at the moment, and I'll wind down a little bit more slowly.
Right. Do you ever see a future where cancer won't be part of our lives?
No, I think there'll be continued improvements at early detection, prevention and treatment, but it is such a big and complex disease that personally I can't see that there's ever anything we'll eradicate. But there have been, for some cancers, there have been really remarkable improvements. For others, not so much so yet.
Right.
But I think, there is a continual slow improvement, at least, for most cancers. And there are hundreds of ongoing clinical trials around the world. So there is a huge amount of activity.
Right. But we are, and I must admit I'm a recipient of this so far, touch wood, fingers, toes crossed. There is so much that can be done in the way of treatment in cancer. I think in the old days, certainly if I'd got ovarian cancer, I'd be out the door and upstairs or downstairs or wherever by now. But I am going to chat to my oncologist in the near future about the treatments for various cancers. But we are very lucky, aren't we, in this day and age, that there is so much treatment.
Yes, yeah, no, even over the course of my career, there have been some major changes. Immunotherapy being one of them, targeted therapy directed against particular genetic mutations being another. There have been remarkable changes, and you see big improvements in survival for many cancers. So that's certainly heartening. But the idea that we will ever be a disease we eliminate and eradicate, I think, is probably a little ambitious.
But thank you to people like you, we know so much more about it. So sadly, we are out of time. But thank you, Professor Georgia Chenevix-Trench, for being my guest today. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to chat to you. And I'm sure our listeners have been fascinated to hear about your wonderful work, including Paul there. It's fascinating, isn't it, Paul?
Certainly is.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, and Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald has been recorded in the studios of 4RPH Reading Radio Brisbane for syndication around Australia. And thank you very, very much, Professor Georgia Chenevix-Trench. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.